I wanted to show you this awesome picture that I found. Two things to discuss just in this one slide. On the one side is the QR code for Hello Thanksmas. So we want you, of course, all to come to Hello Thanksmas. That's November 14th at 6 p.m.? Yep. At 6 p.m. So if you want to bring food, then get on that QR code and sign up. You don't have to bring food. Like if you're worried about that, then just come because we want you to be there. But if you want to bring food, then get on that QR code and sign up. But if you don't bring food, then this image is just going to curse you for forever. So prepare yourself for that. Anyways. Sorry. Feel free to scan the QR code. I mean, yeah. Good? Are we good on the QR code? Hey, everybody. QR code, we good? We good? We good? Okay. All right, now we're going to talk about class. So tonight is the third of 4 lessons on the spiritual journey series. And this one is Habakkuk. And next week we'll go to the New Testament and we'll talk about someone new to close. But for tonight we're talking about Habakkuk, and this is like one of my favorite books of the Bible. So I'm really excited to teach it to you tonight because I get to nerd out on it a little bit. So that's fun. And so I want to start with this thing. How many of you, raise your hand, are good at keeping a secret? Okay, almost. I'm pretty sure almost half of you that raise your hand are just not. Like that's how it always goes. Everybody says they're good at keeping a secret, and then you give them a secret and it's out. And plus, this is Faulkner. You know how it goes. Anyways, but I want you to think about this. So, completely ideal scenario. Really might not even be a good example, but we're gonna try it. Imagine that your friend gets caught plagiarizing. This has happened to me before. But not anyways, your friend gets caught plagiarizing. And the rest of the class also plagiarized. And they all get caught, but only your friend faces the penalty. And so you know that this penalty is going to happen. Your friend doesn't know yet. Nobody else knows the punishment that they're about to face. But you know that your friend's about to get penalized for it and nobody else is. I know it's a weird scenario, but follow me. So you know about the punishment, and you're not allowed to say anything that happens. You just pretty much have to watch your friend get kicked out of school. And so what do you do? Are you supposed to just tell your friend, hey, you're about to get kicked out of school, I'm just letting you know now? Or do you just let them face it without knowing it? Do you just keep the secret? Or what about the others? Do the other people that plagiarize, do they get punished too? And why is this professor only mad at this one person? Only mad at your friend when everybody got caught plagiarizing? Why is your friend the only one to get kicked out? It would be a burden to carry a secret like that. To carry really almost any secret that you want to tell people, but especially a secret that involves punishment of people close to you, it can be a burden to carry. And so tonight we're going to talk about the journey of the burdened, and that is Habakkuk's journey. And Habakkuk had to live his life from the point that we're about to talk about and on, knowing about the destruction of his nation, of Judah. So to give you some context, Habakkuk's name means, it's the verb for embrace. It was probably around before 640 BC, which that's kind of irrelevant for you, but he saw Babylon's threat as imminent. Babylon was going to come in and take over the nation of Judah and bring out exiles and bring them to the land of Babylon. These were all things that were bound to happen, they were going to happen. But he knew about it. And so he lived in the last few decades of Judah's existence before Babylon actually took them over. So Habakkuk is going to show us the journey of those who are burdened. He's burdened because of this vision that he's about to see, the knowledge that he's about to obtain that tells of the destruction of Judah by Babylon. And so this is the first verse, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. Now, I've read Habakkuk multiple times, I've studied it, and I've never really thought anything about this specific verse. But this time as I was going through it, I noticed this. The word oracle, it translates, not that I'm some sort of Hebrew scholar by any means, but it translates to the common word of burden, which is funny because I was thinking of how can I differentiate the 3 people that we've talked so far, because they're all kind of similar in the ways that they question God and things like that. So how can I find the differences. And for this one, I was going to focus on Habakkuk and the burden that he had to carry. And so then, as I'm going through, I see that this word oracle, it can also translate to the word burden. So when a prophet was given a prophecy, it was sometimes a burden for them because they couldn't announce it yet. Like until they could announce it, it was like hard to keep it in. Jeremiah describes it like this in Jeremiah 20 verse 9. He says, "If I say I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, there is in my heart as it were a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I am weary with holding it in, and I cannot." So like, even for Jeremiah, it was really difficult to hold in this secret. Like he wanted to tell people what was happening and about the prophecy, but for prophets, it was sometimes difficult for them to keep it in. Like it was just, it says like it was burning in his bones. Like he wants to tell people about it. So it could be a burden for them. Habakkuk is very much different than the rest of the prophets for a couple of reasons. One, most of the time prophets aren't actually called prophets, but Habakkuk was called a prophet twice, in verse 1 of chapter 1 here and in verse 1 of chapter 3. And also, Habakkuk isn't actually accusing Israel of anything. In fact, throughout the whole book, he doesn't ever actually speak to Israel, which most prophets like go and prophesy, and they go and talk to the nation of whatever they're in. But Habakkuk doesn't. He directly talks to God because of his confusion and his frustration. And so throughout the whole book, we're going to see this dialogue that Habakkuk has with God, and it's unique. And I think it's really awesome to be able to look at this back and forth that they have. Especially because God actually responds. But we're going to start in verse 2. So we're going to go through verses 2 and 4. Can someone read that for me?
O Lord, help me out for our sacrifice, and you will not hear. For fight you violence, and you will not save. Why do you make me see iniquity, or why do you always look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the walls paralyze, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked around the righteous, so justice goes forth.
So what is Habakkuk's complaint? This is the first complaint that he gives, and what is it? What's he saying?
Complaining about having to hold his.
Well, so he doesn't know it yet. Like he's about to learn it soon, but at first, this is his first initial complaint to God. Yeah, so that's the first thing, is that he's been crying out to God for help and he hasn't heard anything back. And he's confused by that, and he just wants God to answer him. But why is he crying out to God? What does it say later on? Because God what? He keeps showing him trouble. Kinda. That's part of it. So toward the end of it, you're going to see he says that destruction and violence are before me, and strife and contention arise. And he says justice never goes forth, so like you're never enacting justice. And he says the wicked surround the righteous, and so the justice is going forth perverted. So what he's saying is there's all this wickedness around me, and I've cried out to you, God, to handle, like to do something about this. There's all this injustice and violence and all these terrible things happening. And God, why aren't you doing anything about it? Like, why are you not acting, I guess? Like he's upset because of God's inaction. And that's why he's saying, it's like there are righteous people. And Habakkuk, as a righteous person, is saying, I'm constantly surrounded by wickedness, and none of them are ever facing any sort of justice. Like they're never being punished for their wickedness. And so, like, why is this happening? Why am I having to go through this? And so, one, we see that Habakkuk thinks that God isn't being just. Shocker, right? The past two people we've talked about, everyone that questions God, it seems like they question God's justice because they think it should be one way, and as people, we're prideful, and we think, like, our way is the way to go, right? And so when we don't understand, we're like, wow, God, you just must not be just if you're not going by what I want, right? And so he questions God. And that's a theme that you're going to see. I mean, he thinks God isn't just, and that's a theme that, oh my goodness, a theme that you're going to see throughout everybody that questions God and just doesn't understand. It usually comes back to their questioning is his justice and his all-knowingness and what his will truly is. But also, he thinks the wicked aren't being punished, and that sin is being allowed to just go free. And that's what he has observed, and so that's what he's questioning God about. So what are some important things to know? One thing is that Habakkuk's been crying out to God for a while now. Like, it doesn't say exactly how long, but I mean, Habakkuk is saying, like, how long am I going to have to cry out to you before you answer me? He sees God as just looking at the violence and destruction that's happening and just being content. Like, God's okay with not punishing or enacting any sort of justice. Nobody was living by the law anymore. That's kind of what it's saying by, like, the law is paralyzed. And so everybody's living by their own greedy way. Like, if you remember, I think last class, Jake brought up how at one point in I think is in one of the Kings or Samuel's, it talks about how they were, maybe as judges, I don't remember. But they were living by their own, like, what they saw fit. Like, they were no longer living by God's law, but they were living by what they thought was right in their own hearts. And so these people are living without the law, but rather greedy and selfishly. He sees God as being inactive. And that's what's caused this wicked and injustice to increase. Like, he just doesn't think that God is doing really anything. But we also can note that there were still some righteous people. They were just surrounded by evil. And he says the wicked are surrounding the righteous, implying that there are righteous people. There's just a lot of wickedness around them. So how long do you think Habakkuk prayed, like, before God answered this prayer? Like, probably a while. How desperate do you think Habakkuk was just waiting on God to answer? Like, don't you think he was discouraged at this point? Like, I mean, this, I feel like, is pretty obvious listening to the words of Habakkuk that he was discouraged. He was like, not to go back to light and dark, but I'm going to do it. He was like a small light. He's like a candle in just this dark abyss. Like, you were still there, and you're still a light, but man, there's so much darkness around you. It's like you're barely can even be seen, you know? And so Habakkuk's, like, he's going through it. He's having a hard time. And so then we see God's response, finally, in verse 5 and 6. Verses 5 through 11, but for right now, let's look at verses 5 and 6. Sam, you want to read that?
Yeah.
Please.
For I am doing a work in your days, that you would not believe me. Behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, to march to the breadth of the earth, to seize dwelling stuff.
So what does God say to him in return? How does God answer? I'm raising up the Chaldeans, like the Babylonians. And he says that they're going to come up and they're going to enact punishment on you, not Habakkuk specifically, but on Judah, because of the wicked that's in Judah. So the answer that God gives him is, okay, like I've actually already been working on this. I'm going to raise up this nation, and they're going to go wipe out the nation of Judah because of the wickedness that lives in Judah. And so we can note a couple things here. God's already been working before he even answered Habakkuk. He says, look among the nations and see, I am doing a work in your days. And it's not like I will be doing a work. He's like, I'm doing this. And like this has already been happening. And we can also see in verse 6 that God's in control of all of the nations and all the world, even Babylon. And you can see that because he says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. And he's going to go on to talk about how great the Chaldeans are. And we'll talk about that briefly in just a second. But he'll talk about how mighty they are and how strong they are as a nation and as an army. But he says, I'm raising them up. Like, God is still in control of what's happening here. And if you remember, like, if you were at teaching at Devo last night, we talked about Nebuchadnezzar some. And you remember how Nebuchadnezzar was, he was the king of Babylon, and he thought that he was like the guy. And he's like, what God is going to save you from me throwing you into this fiery furnace, talking to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he's saying, like, I'd like to see any God try, and things like that, which the point was brought up, like, this is God we're talking about, like the one that put you in this place. So God's still in control, and it's important to remember throughout this whole book. But God was answering Habakkuk's prayers. He had already been answering Habakkuk's prayers. Habakkuk just didn't know. His answer was, I'm going to send this mighty people, and they're going to wipe out the nation of Judah and punish you for all your wickedness. So in verses 7 through 11, he goes on and he describes the mightiness of the people and how savage they are and how big and great their army is and how they're going to wipe out the nation of Judah. He says that they weren't bound by the Judean law, and so they abused their power, and they really didn't have much of a moral law. And so that pretty much just tells you like how evil they were okay with being. In verse 11, it describes them as people whose own might was their God. So they don't need to worship other gods for protection is how they felt because they were so mighty and powerful that they could protect themselves. So shouldn't Habakkuk be happy, like that God finally answered? Like he's been praying all this time, however long it's been, and then he finally gets an answer, and God says, I actually have this solution for you. I'm going to send this nation, and they're going to wipe your whole nation out. Like all of the wicked, everybody in this nation, he's going to wipe them out, and Judah will not be Judah any longer. But he got an answer. Like Habakkuk got an answer. So how does he respond? You go to verse 12, and verses 12 through chapter 2, verse 1, you see Habakkuk's response. Jimmy, you want to read verses 12 through 13?
Are you not from everlasting? O Lord my God, my King, you shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for a truth. You who are of pure eyes look to see evil and do not look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he?
So what do we see? What does Habakkuk say just in verse 12? Like what is he telling God just in verse 12? He's upset. Yeah, he is. But in verse 12, what's the first thing he says? We'll talk about that first. Yeah, so he says, like, you are the one God. He says you're everlasting. And he establishes, like, he makes sure that God knows, and he establishes, like, God, you are the one true God, and you're never going to die. You're everlasting, you're eternal. And then he goes on to say, I see that you've ordained them as judgment. Like, these people are your agent of punishment, like your agent of judgment, and I see that. Like, I see that you're using Babylon to punish people. So Habakkuk he sees these two things, and then what does he say in verse 13?
I guess it's basically saying, like, why do bad things happen to good people, you know? Like, so righteous and stuff, like, why do, you know, like, wrong things happen to them too, and not just the bad.
Yeah, so, to an extent, exactly. He says, like, he's kind of saying, like, are your eyes just too pure to see what's the injustice that's happening here, God? Like, there's these Chaldeans, these Babylonian people are coming in, and he says that the wicked, are going to swallow up the man more righteous than he. And so he's trying to establish that Judah is more righteous than the Chaldeans. So I ask, is Judah more righteous? I mean, like, they're God's people, aren't they? Are they more righteous? Yeah, I mean, they're still, like, not obeying God's covenant. And so at this point, it's like, they're God's chosen people, yes. But are they acting like God's chosen people? Like, they're in a covenant with God, but are they fulfilling their side of the covenant? And the answer is no. And so the ultimate, like, overarching idea here is that sin deserves punishment. Like, sin deserves some sort of negative consequence. Because God is a just God, he's going to deal that punishment. And so the wicked people that are in Judah that Habakkuk was just complaining about, they deserve punishment. Like, and that's just how the nature of God is, because he is just and because sin deserves it. And so he hasn't said anything about what he's going to do to Babylon yet. He just says, like, this, I'm going to use Babylon to punish you. And Habakkuk immediately gets mad. Like, well, they're worse than we are. Like, yeah, like, we might be bad, but they're even worse. So this is unjust just in this. So he goes on to describe Babylon as fishermen in verses 14 through 17. And he says, God, how long are you going to allow these Chaldean people, these evil people, to be like fishermen that just throw their nets into the ocean, and they bring in all these fish, and they praise their nets for being so great, and they have all these fish that they stash away, and through their food, like, they become rich. But then they just go on and cast their nets out, and they just keep going and keep going, talking about the Chaldean violence and the greed that they show. And he's like, God, how long are you going to allow this to happen? And so then in chapter 2, verse 1, he says, I will be on my watchtower waiting for an answer. Like, he compares himself to someone on a watchtower. He says, God, like, I am anxiously awaiting you to answer me this question. And so God answers. He has a second response. And it goes through verses 2 through 20. But we're going to talk about verses 2 through 5 first. Philip, you want to read that?
Yeah. The Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so you may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. But the righteous shall live by his faith. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as a shield. Like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects all of his.
Let's start from the top down. Like, what are some things to note? What are some things that you're like, why does he say that? What do you think about this passage? Yeah, which is funny, but being told to Habakkuk, who's began the book with, like, how long am I going to have to pray to you, God? Like, how much time am I going to have to spend being around these wicked people and crying out to you until you answer? And God says, write this down and make it plain and wait. Wait for the answer. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah, what else? We can talk about the top, right? So it says to write this vision. Like, why do you think that's important? Like, why would he need to write the vision? It's significant. And it should be discussed for generations to come what's going to happen. The fact that God is in control and the fact that the wicked will be punished no matter who the wicked is an important principle that needs to be passed down. And so he says to write this down and make it plain so that anyone can read this. And so that's one thing. What do you see in verse 4 that you think is significant?
It says his soul's puffed up, but who does it refer to?
Babylon. So, well, he's talking, in context, he's talking about Babylon. But really, you could take this verse and talk about anybody who's puffed up, like anybody who's arrogant. And you could really apply this. But specifically, in this context, he's talking about Babylon because he just finished, and I didn't spend enough time talking about it probably, but he just finished talking about how greedy and selfish the Chaldeans are and how mighty they are and prideful they are. And Habakkuk kind of talked about the same thing a little bit. So that's what he's saying. This Babylon, they're puffed up and they're not upright. So he goes on to say, the righteous will live by faith. Even in the darkest of days, even in the darkest of times, even with these Chaldeans coming in, those who are righteous in Judah, you'll live by faith. Like the people that really want to follow me and have faith in me will continue to follow me and have faith in me even after these Chaldeans come in. And that's what God's trying to establish. And in verse 5, he goes on to talk about how greedy Babylon is and how they take down all of these nations. And so he goes on to talk about the woe oracles. And it's verses 6 through 20, and we're not going to read all of this, but he lists all of these woes. And so he talks about excessive greed and conquest in verses 6 through 8. He talks about relying on treasures and wealth for protection in verses 9 through 11. He talks about violence and injustice of the Chaldeans in verses 12 through 14, and he talks about how they're violent to their neighbors in verses 15 through 17. And then at the end of the chapter, in chapter 2, he closes with verses 18 through 20, which talks about idolatry and how they worship idols and they worship these pieces of wood and metal that are made with hands and not the one true God. And so that's just that section alone is an awesome passage just to go back and study in verses 18 through 20, but we just don't have time to do that tonight. So God listed all these woes. He takes this section of the chapter to go through and say, here's all of the reasons that I'm actually going to enact punishment on Babylon. Like he says, woe to them who, and describes their wrongs. And he says, whoa, 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 all these times to talk about all of the things that they're doing that are wrong. And he's basically saying, like, this is the reason that I'm going to punish them. Like, here's the list of reasons that they're also wicked, and they're also eventually going to have to face punishment. So he's saying, like, just because I'm using them as an agent of punishment, as people that I'm using to punish Judah, that doesn't mean that eventually they're not going to face punishment too, because sin deserves punishment. And it's owed to the one who sinned that they are punished. And so Judah, who was wicked, deserves punishment. But on the same plane, Babylon, who was also wicked, also deserves punishment. And that's not quite something that Habakkuk fully understands, which is why he questions it so much. So God explains all of these reasons. This is why I'm going to punish them. Do you think that this answer helps Habakkuk? Like, does it make him feel better about Judah's imminent destruction? Maybe. Like, it might. I would say that it probably at least gives him some comfort, and we'll see that in the next passage, that he at least gains some understanding. But also, he still has to face the fact that his nation's about to be taken over by a really evil nation. And he has to bear the burden of that secret, of that thing that God has told him that he can't announce yet. But we get into chapter 3. Could someone read for me verses 1 and 2?
The prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to God.
Yep.
O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I hear in the midst of the years of life? In the midst of the years, make it known, and wrath remember mercy.
So his tone has drastically changed from like not knowing. Well, he starts the chapter with, how long am I going to have to ask you to be there for me and to help me out in this situation where the wicked are surrounding me? And then he goes on to, like, you're really going to let these evil people take over those who are righteous, like the ones who are much more righteous than they. So he's questioning God and he's questioning God. And then in this section in chapter 3, Habakkuk's tone drastically changes to, it is the Lord that I fear. And he says, in your wrath, remember mercy on those who are righteous. Like, remember us. And so this book goes from a psalm of lament to a psalm of trust, and trust in God. The beginning of the book, we see Habakkuk, he's angry, he's confused, he's upset, and he's questioning God's justice and his goodness. And then after having this conversation with God, however long it took, we see the results of the spiritual journey that Habakkuk took in this chapter. So he says that he's heard of these mighty works. In verse 2 at the very beginning, he says, I've heard the report of you. So likely he was probably in the temple, and he heard something about God's greatness and about how God delivers his people. And he goes on to talk about the Exodus, like the Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites leaving Egypt and going to the Promised Land. He goes on to talk about this throughout chapter 3 because he desires a new demonstration of judgment and mercy from God. Now, he is pleading with God for both judgment and mercy. Judge the wicked, but also, please have mercy on those who are righteous as well. So he sets up the stage to describe God's appearance and his works in the Exodus from Egypt. But the entire time he's implying, this is what I want to happen. While my people are in exile in Babylon, and when we are facing these mighty Chaldean people, remember us like you remembered the Egyptians. And so he talks about God's appearance in verses 3 through 7. And he kind of references Mount Sinai as he does this. And he shows how great and terrifying God's power is when he appears to confront the evil of man. And everybody in the world should take notice, as Habakkuk describes a lightning storm and an earthquake. These are two things that cannot be controlled by man at all. We can't control an earthquake or a lightning storm or any sort of natural disaster. But he describes these two great storms as things that are happening as God comes to confront evil. Basically, just trying to get across the idea that we can't control God as he comes to confront, man and their wrong. We can't control the one who created the world, is kind of the idea that he's getting across. And so he talks about Exodus 19, verses 18 through 20, as Moses went up to Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments, and there's some parallels between what we read about in verses 3 through 7 and the descriptions of the storms and how God appears on Mount Sinai. And then we see the same thing in Psalm chapter 18, verses 7 through 14, with the description of God's appearance when he comes to David in his time of need. You see that David describes him almost the same way of there's a whirlwind or there's a storm, and there's really similar language between it all. But then we get into verse 8, and I want you to notice, I'm about to show just a few different verses. I want you to notice the language that's the similar between what we're about to read and in the Exodus. And so in verse 8, Mackenzie, can you read it?
Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers? Or your indignation against the seas when you rode on your horses on your chariot of salvation?
Okay, so here's the first verse. What do you see in this that makes you think of the Exodus? The sea. So there was what bodies of water did God use during the Exodus?
Part
Part of the Red Sea? The Jordan? One more. The Nile. You turn water to blood. You should have said it. You should have said it. Anyways, he uses water to enact his will and his punishment or whatever is happening, like whatever he wants to happen. There's times where God uses water. And so he says, was your wrath against the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Your indignation against the sea? And he's mentioning these bodies of water. So then we go on in verse 11. So Susanna, can you read this? What do you think of when you read this? Are you thinking? Just say it.
Was it Moses who, or no, it was some individual, I wouldn't say Moses, but they were in battle and he had his hands up to the heavens, and like time basically just stood still.
So he's talking about Joshua in Joshua 10 verses 12 through 13, Joshua's victory at Gibeah, and the sun stood still. He asked God to have the sun stand still, and then they were able to win because of that. So we go on in verse 13. Ashley, can you read it?
You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your nation. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare before the Father.
Oh, yes. So what do you see? Who's the anointed? Let's talk about that first. Who's the anointed? God's chosen people. That's who the anointed is. And so this made me think of, like, with the death angel, like in the Passover, and God saved his anointed people, but really just the entire time, like throughout the whole Exodus, anytime that God was with his people, he saved them. They were like his chosen ones, and he saved them throughout the whole journey. And so then we see this thing, like, who's the head of the house of the wicked? And it could be Pharaoh, or it could be like the leaders of Canaan that he's talking about, like the people that had to face God's wrath through Israelites' army because they didn't serve God as Israel was working through the promised land. So it could be one of those two people, but either way, it's reverting back to like Egypt, or not Egypt, but the Israelites and the Israelites escaping Egypt. So we get through verses 14 and 15. Someone want to read that?
The heads of his warriors who came like a whirlwind to scatter them, racing as if to devour its floor and secret. Who trampled the sea with the horses and mighty waters.
What do you say? The Red Sea. Dude, y'all are so scared. Like, I'm not gonna get mad at you if you're wrong or something. I mean, I definitely might do that. Anyways. That's definitely characteristic of it. Yeah, so with the Egyptian army, and they're going through the Red Sea, and then God closes the waters in, and all the Egyptians are like, oh, water, and they die. And so that's kind of like what's obviously being referenced in verse 15. So Habakkuk uses this Exodus story of the past to become an image of what he wants for his people and the judgments that the judgment that the Babylonians will face. Hence the desire for a new judgment and mercy. So we get to the end of the book in verse 16. Somebody want to read that?
I feared and my body trembled. My lips quivered at the sound. Rottenness entered into my bones. My legs trembled beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people.
So this might be kind of a tough question, but what do you think Habakkuk's talking about here? Like, why is he describing himself as this way?
like the wrath of God is going to bring judgment on the people when he comprehends what the Bible is.
Yeah, so it's like there's a couple of different ways that I thought about this, and that was my first thought. I was like, oh, he now understands who God is. Like, this guy gets it. Like, he understands the wrath of God, and he is super scared. And so I don't necessarily know if that's right or wrong, and one of y'all might be able to tell me, like, no, that's not what's being said here. But this time, as I read through it, there's another thing that was mentioned that I was like, oh, that kind of makes more sense. And it was that he was describing like how he feels bearing this burden of the secret. Because he says, like, my lips quiver at the sound, rottenness enters my bones. Like, he's hearing all these things that are going to happen, and he's like really upset about it. Like, wow, like these Chaldeans are about to come in and really wipe us out. And he says, yeah, I will quietly wait for the day of trouble. Like, all right, like I know these things, it's terrible, and I hate that I know it. Like, or at least I hate that this is all going to happen, but I'm just going to sit here and wait for this to happen. Like, I'm just going to quietly wait for the day of trouble, for these people to come and invade us. And so that's what I lean towards, is that interpretation of it. And then if y'all think I'm wrong, then that's okay. We can talk about it. But anyways, Habakkuk is like struggling with the idea that he has to like not talk about this. So let me go through verses 17 through 19. Cameron, do you want to read this?
And the fig tree should not blossom, and there would be no fruit on the vines. Fruit, though the root of the olive should fail, and the wood produce no food. For the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls. Yet I exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds feet, and makes me walk on the high places.
So no matter what like disastrous things happen in the land of Judah, Habakkuk is always going to trust God. So he talks about the crops and the livestock being lost, and that there might not be food to eat, but that he will always be joyful. In verse 18, he's always going to rejoice because he trusts in God. And he can be joyful because of the God he serves, not the circumstances he faces. Like he doesn't want what's going to happen to happen. Like, I mean, nobody, of course, wants some terrible, evil, wicked nation to come and take over your own nation. Like, you don't want to have to face those consequences. Of course, nobody would want that. So he's not rejoicing in the circumstances that he's going to face, but he's rejoicing in the fact that he serves God and that he can trust God. And so because of his trust in God, he can be joyful in that. And we see that God has become Habakkuk's strength. In verse 19, he says, God the Lord is my strength. And in fact, he says that I can be sure-footed in the high places, even amidst extreme conditions, because God is his strength. So we see a journey that begins in distress and calamity ends in great joy because of the understanding of the incomprehensible plan of God. Now, Habakkuk still bears this burden of secret. He knows that his nation is going to face destruction, and that stinks. But he still finds the Lord as his strength. Like he turns to the Lord during these times where he knows the circumstances are going to be difficult, and he's going to be going through terrible things, and he goes to God for strength in that. So Habakkuk becomes a perfect example of how the righteous will live by faith, like in chapter 2. Habakkuk puts aside his own natural pride of what he thinks is right and his arrogance. He's not puffed up. And instead of idolizing his own desires and what he thinks is best, he puts all of his faith in a being that's much greater than himself. That, of course, being God. And so knowing that these dark days are ahead, instead of dwelling on that, he is able to remain faithful to God, therefore fulfilling the righteous shall live by faith. So we have like a minute and a half left. What are some things that we can learn from Habakkuk? What is something that you picked up you didn't know? Something you can learn from him? Anything? Just say it.
Well, the last part of Habakkuk kind of just reminds me of Philippians chapter 4. A lot of just being able to still reflect and rejoice in the Lord and all of his glory, no matter what's going to be coming. You know, you can still have that one delight. It's going to be.
Yeah. What else?
When, you know, when stuff happens to us, and we're like, God reminds the situation, and you know, like, step back and be like, yes, this is going on, but if you really even trust in God, He does have a plan, and He will take care of us. We just need to wait for it, and not just assume it's not going to happen.
Yeah, like it's not wrong to pray to Him and to not understand, but it's as the righteous, like we're called to also remember that God has a plan, and so we need to keep living by faith. Anything else before we close up?
It's kind of going on that real quick. We're not always the things that we think we are. Back to God is being extremely patient with waiting out for a really long time, and then God called him again. Be patient.
Yeah.
Yeah, this has happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're not waiting.
Yeah. He's like, wait on it again. Yeah. All right. Well,